temple police. They had sent the temple police, that's what it was called, a temple. It was sort of a military / police outfit that the Romans allowed the Jews to have, headquartered there at the temple. They'd sent those fellas to get Jesus. Well, the officers answered, "No man ever spoke like this man." Then the Pharisees answered, "Are you also deceived? Have any of the rulers of the Pharisees believed in him? But this crowd that does not know the law is accursed." So the Pharisees' position was, if anybody really knows the law of Moses, they won't accept Jesus as the Messiah. That was their official position. Of course, I think it had more to do, their opposition to him at that time had a lot more to do with the fact that he was so popular among the common people, and they were not. The Pharisees and the scribes, not to mention the Sadducees, they were not popular among the common people. But Jesus was, because the way he taught and what he said not only appealed to them, it was what they needed, and they recognized that need. And so that's why they said, "But this crowd that does not know the law is accursed." But then Nicodemus, we remember him from John chapter 3. Nicodemus spoke up and said, and he's identified here by the Apostle John as the one who came to Jesus by night, being one of them, that is, he is a Pharisee. He says, "Does our law judge a man before it hears him and knows what he is doing?" Now, Nicodemus is asking that question in a rhetorical fashion because he knows the answer. The law of Moses does not judge a man before it hears him and before it knows what he's doing. But Nicodemus knew that that group of Pharisees, the ones that were so vividly opposed to Jesus, he knew that that's the way they operated. In other words, if you weren't on their team, they didn't want you. And so he asked that question. And so they answered and said to him, "Are you also from Galilee? Search and look, no prophet has arisen out of Galilee." Their position was that the Messiah is not going to come out of Galilee. Well, the fact that Jesus had been in Galilee and had operated out of Capernaum, Galilee, up in that area, doesn't mean that that's where he came. We know where Micah prophesied. He came out of Bethlehem. He was born in Bethlehem. And that's, of course, what the text says. But they were dodging all of those points. They were just anything they could come up with to manufacture a reason to reject Jesus as the Messiah. This particular group of the Pharisees, see, not all Pharisees were this way, but this particular group of the Pharisees that was so rabid, they were vivid, they were rabid, they were really agitated with the very idea of Jesus as the Christ. They didn't want anything to do with him. So even though Nicodemus gave them something to think about, they rejected him and his position also at that point in time. So what was the end of that section? Verse 53, "And everyone went to his own house." No settlement of the issue, no conclusion drawn. Everyone went to their own house. But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Now, the Mount of Olives, it's like this part of the country, Jerusalem. Of course, Jerusalem, the temple and all, is on Mount Zion, you see. But then across, there's a valley, pretty substantial valley. It goes in different directions. It has different directions, has different names, depending upon the direction that you go in that valley. There are big cemeteries in it. It leads down to an old waterway and so forth. And, if you're standing on the Mount of Olives and you look across, you see the Temple Mount. And then back over that way is the city of David is what they call that part of it. But so Jesus left wherever they were having this discussion, and I don't remember exactly, or if it says precisely where they were. He left there and he went to the Mount of Olives, which would not far, I think. And if I remember, it's been a long time since I was over there, but if I remember going from the Temple Mount, if they were in that area, to the Mount of Olives, would be like going out here and walking down the hill and up the hill, going over to the other hill, from East Hill to the hill that the rest of Pulaski's sitting on over there. Be about that kind of a distance. So he goes to the Mount of Olives. The text says, now early in the morning he came again into the temple. So he's stationed a lot of times when he's around Jerusalem, and this is consistent quite with regard to wherever you find him. He'll be at the Mount of Olives and go over to the temple, teach on the temple grounds, in that area of the temple where teaching was often done, not the temple proper, not the actual most holy place and holy place, but in the grounds where people would be there gathered to listen to people teach. So he went into the temple, and the people came to him. See, he was popular because they knew, the common folks knew there was something about the way he approached teaching God's word that they wanted to hear. They wanted to listen to that. And he sat down and taught them. So this is, like I said, it's not at the temple proper has the most holy place and the holy place, and then there's the court of Israel and the court of the women and the court of the area that the Gentiles could enter into, and then the porches. The porches we're talking about, this is the area where a lot of this teaching is done. And so the scribes and Pharisees, as he's teaching in this area, wherever it is precisely, the scribes and Pharisees brought to him a woman caught in adultery. And when they had set her in the midst, they said to him, Teacher, or Rabbi, this woman was caught in adultery in the very act. Now, there are three parties involved in this situation. There's Jesus, of course, and there's the woman, and there are the scribes and the Pharisees. And the fourth party would be the audience that would be listening to this discussion. And so Jesus, being popular, he of course was the object of jealousy by the Pharisees. They wanted to be, expression where I was growing up, they wanted to be the big dog. They wanted to be the one that everybody paid attention to. They didn't want anybody to listen to anybody else. You see this kind of jealousy in business. You see it in schools. You see it in families. You even see it in the church sometimes. You shouldn't, but we do. So they were going to be jealous of Jesus. So they were trying to find a way to object to him in a fashion that would resonate with the people. And so they have this woman, and they said that she was caught in adultery, and they set her in the midst, caught in adultery in the very act. Now, that of course brings up questions, doesn't it? How does one, particularly if you are a group of Pharisees who are supposed to be qualified teachers of the law of Moses, what we might say is they're supposed to at least be able to do a little preaching. How is it that that group of fellas catches a woman in the act of adultery? Well, it doesn't make much sense, does it? You know, because adultery is generally not done out in the open. Now, we have no way to deny the fact that she might have been committing adultery, but most adultery is done in a very private fashion. But they have somehow arranged to catch this woman in the act, which means that there may have been great lengths gone to by Jesus' enemies to find a situation that they think he can't deal with. So that's what they're looking for. They're looking for a way to build a wall between Jesus and the people with whom he is so popular, and that is the regular folks. So they have somehow connived to catch this woman in a situation that she was in. Of course, Jesus tells her to go her way and sin no more, so obviously she was involved in sinful behavior. But the point is, of course, that's going to a lot of trouble, and without any regard to the well-being of anybody involved. Now, you say, well, what kind of woman would this be? Well, we don't know, do we? Now, there were certainly prostitutes in the first century. Could it be that was the way she made her way? It could be. Or it could be an adulterous situation much like those that we see in our world today. Just where, a marriage has gone wrong and gone bad, and there's, But the question that ought to pop into anybody's mind is, where was the fella? Adultery is an activity that takes two people, not just one. It takes two. And so, but he's not there, is he? Well, now that speaks to a lot of things about what's going on at this time in history. Galatians chapter 3, verses 26 through 28 says there's neither bond nor free, male nor female. So, see, but in the Jewish mind of the first century, I'm not talking about the present-day Jewish mind, I'm talking about the mind that the Jews should have had. I'm talking about the mind that these fellas, these Pharisees, had, was a man can do a lot of things a woman can't do. And a man was able to get away with a lot of things in that time and since that a woman can't get away with, wouldn't be allowed to get away with. We've seen a lot of changes in our time, but the fact is that still women have a harder road, particularly if they're by themselves in our world. Maybe not so much in our country, but in our world, than do the men. So, but the question is, where was the man? Well, they didn't catch the man, did they? They didn't bring the man. They brought the woman, which I don't know what that has to do with what happened, but I'll tell you, I think it had something to do with it, because the text goes on to say, they tell him, they said, now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. But what do you say? Well, Leviticus 20 and verse 10, that's what it says. But now in the first century in Jerusalem, according to the material that's available for us to research, there probably wasn't as much stoning of adulterous people as there had been in earlier times. And generally speaking, the people that got stoned for adultery were people who committed adultery who were the wrong people. You know what I mean by the wrong people? It's like in our world today. I remember when we lived down in Georgia, we lived in a very nice town and served people we still love very much. But the point is, of course, if you were the right person in that community, there was one set of laws for you. But if you were the wrong person in that community, there was another set of laws for you.
Kind of like our nation today.
Sort of, kind of. Absolutely. Depends on who you are. But in this particular situation, evidently, the fellow didn't fall under the heading of being in that kind of category. So they said, now the law says that we ought to stone her. Well, whether that would have been popular to do or not popular to do, they did stone people in the first century. And That's what they did. And this is not throw rocks at you. This, remember, first century stoning, if it was meant to, as a punishment for a serious crime, this was you knock the person down and then you keep dropping big rocks on them until they die. And you hurt them badly. It wasn't meant to be just a punishment that you could get up and overcome. So they said, well, the law says we ought to stone her. What do you say? The verse, John tells us through inspiration, verse 6, this they said, testing him, that they might have something of which to accuse him. So, see, Jesus is in this situation where he's going to be wrong according to the Pharisees no matter what he says. If he says, yes, that's what the law says, go ahead and stone her, then whoever is on her side, and have you ever seen a situation of adulterous relationships where somebody wasn't on the other side? You know, something's going to be wrong. And then if he says don't stone her, they're going to say, well, you won't go by the law. So they're trying to catch him. But they've got the wrong fellow to try to catch. He's a whole lot sharper than they are. Of course, he's infinitely sharp, isn't he? So he didn't say anything, which, by the way, is a tremendous methodology for dealing with people like Pharisees. When they're trying to get you in a tight spot, sometimes it's better not to say anything. Let them keep going. But of course, that's not all that Jesus did. The text says that Jesus stooped down and wrote on the ground with his finger as though he did not hear. As though he did not hear. And so he wrote something. One of the texts, it's called the majority text the majority text does include this. Some of the texts don't include that, but he's writing on the ground. Now, what's he writing? Wouldn't you like to know? We'd all like to know what he wrote. That's one of those famous things that we talk about in Bible study, things that we can't answer. We love those questions we can't answer. And the question is, what was he writing? I don't know what he wrote. But he wrote, and he wrote it where they could see it. So when they continued asking him, he raised up and said to them, he who is without sin among you, let him throw a stone at her first. And then he stooped down again and wrote on the ground. Now, what did he write on the ground? What do you think he wrote on the ground? Could have been 10 Commandments. That would make sense, wouldn't it, Cole? He's without sin, cast the first stone. These Pharisees there, you reckon Jesus knew who they were? Jesus knew who everybody was. Somebody said, how could he know who everybody is? Who is Jesus? He's God. John 1:14, the Word became flesh and dwelt among men. He could have wrote the 10 Commandments. He could have wrote commandments, specific commandments, that some of the fellows who were gathered there in favor of stoning this woman broke. Thou shalt not steal. Covet your neighbor's. All of that. He could have wrote somebody's name. You standing there and you look over there and you see your name, how you going to feel? It's going to be a little bit agitating, isn't it, if that's the case? I don't know, but there's two things. Kohler mentions one, the idea of he who's without sin. Well, how do you get to be a sinner? You break the law. So he could have wrote the law. Then he could have wrote the name of the person that he had in mind that broke the law, in addition to the one who they are interested in stoning. So he stooped down and wrote on the ground second time. Then those who heard it being convicted by their conscience. That's an interesting expression, isn't it? They begin to leave. Whatever he wrote down, this shows that no matter if a person's a Pharisee or Sadducee or any other kind of person, if the right methodology is used, Jesus always used the right methodology. I don't, but he did. You don't, but he did. If the right methodology is used, you can reach people. So they were convicted by their conscience. Whatever he wrote on the ground, and when he said, "He who is without sin cast the first stone," they knew they couldn't. They knew they couldn't throw those stones at her. They couldn't stone that woman. They went out one by one, beginning with the oldest, even to the last, or the least, as some translations say. So the old fellas, which is me and a few of y'all, the old fellas look down there and say, "He's got us this time, boys. we are not in a position to stone this lady." And they start leaving. And finally it gets down to the younger ones. And Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst. So Jesus is there. He gets right down to the very end of the situation. And what does he say to her? He says, "Woman, where are those accusers of yours? Has no one condemned you?" Now we look at that and we wonder, why did he say that? Why did he say that, by the way? There are a lot of scholars in here. He said that because you couldn't punish anybody unless you had someone who could accuse you and prove that you had done the wrong thing. You can't punish people without, we would call it, you're innocent until what? Proven guilty, unless, of course, you're in politics, and then you're either guilty or innocent from the beginning, right? Did I say that out loud? I didn't mean to. But anyway, you know what I mean. But anyhow, so he said, where are these guys? Where'd they go? And they said, "Well, there's nobody here." She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said to her, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." Now, some people I have read say that this doesn't sound right to them, because if she's committed adultery, she ought to be accused of doing that by the Lord, who would know that. Well, the thing is, what he is saying, according to Leviticus 20 and other places, he wasn't in a position. Now, he could, as God, know what she was doing, but he wasn't in a position, according to the law of Moses, to accuse that woman. He says, "Neither do I. I don't accuse you either." So he does tell her, "Go and sin no more." That's a simple set of directions, isn't it? Probably some of the hardest that anybody ever heard. You know, all of us struggle with temptation. I think most of us would admit that we do. He who is without sin casts the first stone. Resumes writing. Then he doesn't condone her sin, though. He tells her, "Go and sin no more." That's the best we can do sometimes, isn't it? Jesus saw the shortcomings of those Pharisees, and they left. Now, the text goes on to say, Jesus spoke to them again, saying, now, there is to me, as I read the text, there is a change in scenery, or change in scene, between 11 and 12. And in actual fact of the matter is, there are Greek texts who leave off with 53 of 7 and don't pick up their Greek text until chapter 8 and verse 12. And that's called that particular text of the New Testament is the one that many of the new translations go by, which is a good text. However, it's not the only text. People ask me from time to time, Bill, what do you preach from? Well, I started preaching from the King James. And I still preach a lot because most of what's in my head is from the King James. All right. But when I started preaching with a lot younger people, now everybody in here can deal with anything. When I started preaching with younger people, I went to the New King James and did this probably 40, 50 years ago. Well, at least 40 years ago. But the New King James goes by the same Greek text that the Old King James does in the New Testament. But they call it, the people who translated the New King James call that text the majority text. And if you have a copy of the New King James Bible, you'll notice that there's a set of notes that runs either in the center column or at the bottom. And in that set of notes, it tells you why the translators of the New King James, which of course came out of Nashville, the translators of the New King James, why they decided to go the way they did when they have these very few challenges or decisions to make with regard to what part of the Greek text to use. So that's why there's this disconnect between 11 and 12 in this thing. Now, the thing is, if you were educated to examine the Greek New Testament the way I was educated, which was by very conservative Bible men like William Woodson and Dow Flatt and people like that, if you're educated like that, you come to understand that there are different points of view with regard to the Greek text of the New Testament. And if you take under consideration every variation in the various Greek texts, and there are thousands of Greek texts altogether, if you take every variation, it amounts to less than 3 or 4% of what's in the text, and most of that is just things like a the or an a, or something very simple, insignificant. The thing about the passage that we're studying today, and I think you ought to know this, I know you probably already know it, is that it is included in over 900 extant copies of the Greek New Testament. Just like, you've heard people tell you that Mark 16 and 9 through 20 is not in the Greek text. It's in most of them. This is in most of them. What the scholars who reject that, the argument they use is that it's not found in some of the oldest Greek texts. Well, that's not an ironclad argument, because, and the argument that the people who translated the New King James use by using this majority text, the argument they use resonates with me, and I think it resonates with a lot of people. Again, even given all the variations, it's less than 3 or 4%. But the argument is, we don't have all of the oldest manuscripts, and we don't. The oldest manuscript of any part of the New Testament that we can actually we can put our faulty eyes on comes right around the end of the 1st century. And there were tons of manuscripts before that time, but they've all disappeared. They're gone. At least so far they're gone. The oldest one that I know about is called P46. P46, parchment 46. And so the thing is, the reason that I think that this passage in John is a valid inclusion in the New Testament, like Mark 16, 9 through 20 is a valid inclusion in the New Testament, is that if these passages show up in a vast majority of the text, that's indicating that that comes from a textual family that is older than some of the textual families that we can lay our hands on. Somebody said, well, what does all this mean? Well, it doesn't really mean much, because there is no variation in doctrine in any of the New Testament texts that can be explained away or thought of as invalid by virtue of whether it's included in every ancient Greek text or not. And that's, of course, what people have stood by for years, particularly people who look at the Bible from a conservative point of view. Now, what does that mean? Now, I hope this is information for you that's helpful to remember. But anyway, what that means is there's a passage in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 16 and 17, which says, all Scripture is given by inspiration of God and profitable for doctrine and reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness. The man of God may be complete, truly furnished unto all good works. If you believe that's true, then you would have to believe, at least I have to believe, that God is not going to allow us to be without the level of instructive material that we would require to know what His will is. Can you imagine God creating the Bible? The Word became flesh and dwelt among men. Can you imagine Him creating the Bible and say, well, I'm not going to take care of them with regard to that. They'll just have to figure it out on their own. I believe providentially, God has protected His Word. So anyway, I thought I'd bring all that up simply because it can be a very big deal to some people. And there's an old saying that my granddaddy would talk about, one of my granddaddies. One of them didn't talk much, the other one did, but I said that a little bit of information is dangerous for a lot of people. And so the thing is, there's always another side to most stories. But if a person thinks historically, you know what I'm talking about. If you think historically, that means there's got to be a reason for what you believe. Got to make some sense. And so by that, we just look at this and we see that this is a very valid story and very, very helpful to us from a spiritual point of view. Anybody have any question or comment down through verse 11?
You're talking about what Jesus wrote, like you said, we don't know, but he could have written something about those who show no mercy, and maybe reference the royal law to them, like I think James talked about that.
Amen.
Loving your neighbor, and and we don't know. It could have very well been the Ten Commandments.
Well, we don't know what he wrote. But what he wrote got somebody's attention. Matter of fact, got everybody's attention. But I think that's right, and that's one valid thing. If you're going to be that way toward her, do you want other people to treat you that way? I don't want to be judged that way. Do any of us? All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. I know, and I believe most Christians these days understand that if we were to be judged strictly, we'd lose. We need mercy. We need grace. Anybody else? Any other good comment? Appreciate it. That would certainly apply to that bunch, wouldn't it, Cole? That bunch of guys would love to have God's vision diverted from their activities. So they pick on this woman that evidently is a sinful woman, but got caught. They wouldn't allow themselves. They wouldn't want to be judged the way that they wanted to judge her.
Do you think, brother, that this statement, judge not, doesn't prevent us from calling out sin?
No.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That's the case. You can't say, you know, someone's in sin.
You mean Matthew 7, judge not that you be not judged. No, that's not what that's about, is it? We all know that. Now, we know, as a practical matter, there are people who like to pass judgment on other people. They like look down their noses at other people. I'm a Virginian. We are very good at that because, you know, you get the elevated pinky going, you get everything like that. But the point is, of course, what is prohibited when the judge not that you be not judged is prejudicial judgment. And if you look at the context of this and the other passages along that line, you judge people, of course, the way you want to be judged. And if I see, for instance, if I see, as a preacher or an elder or a deacon or a friend, if you see a friend in trouble in their marriage, just use that example, or somebody, a young man in trouble in terms of his behavior, when you go to him, you say, now what you're doing, I want to talk to you about what you're doing. And I want you to know something before we talk about this, that I made a lot of mistakes in my life. Now, you may not have made very many, but I can say I made a lot. But I want you to avoid the consequences of any sinful behavior. Therefore, out of love, I want to tell you, you know, what I got to tell you. It's like, you know, somebody could see me go down, not lately. Somebody could see me go down the road at 85 miles an hour. Say, Bill, you passed me going 85. Well, they got a right to say that because, number one, that's not what the law says to do. I dare you to get from Athens to Huntsville and not do it, but nonetheless, the point is, of course, if somebody sees me doing something, let's get off the speeding. Too much sensitivity with regard to that. If somebody saw me speak in a harsh manner to this girl right here and said, son, you shouldn't do that, they'd have a right to do it. So we can rebuke sin, but we have to do it out of a spirit of love and mercy. And they heard somebody say a long time ago, people will let you help them with their sin if they know you care about them. But if they think you've got the attitude these Pharisees had, they won't listen to you. You've got to prove to folks that you love them. One reason that when I was doing local work, did a lot of visitation and stuff, I had to prove to people that I cared about them so they would listen to me when I was preaching. And that's what we do. But yes, we have to rebuke sin when we see it, but we have to. The first person that we rebuke sin is who? Me, myself. And then I can go forward there. Anybody else? Good points. I think we're almost out of time. But if you'll notice in verses 13 through the end of this chapter, you've got a continual intellectual, spiritual battle between Jesus and the Pharisees. And so if you'd like to, when you have opportunity, maybe by the next time we come up here, take a look at chapter 8, verses 13 through 30, because I'm going to preach on 34 and following in a little while, Lord willing. But you look down through verse 30 and look at Jesus versus the Pharisees. It's I, Jesus says, I versus you. It's a pretty good sermon in there, you know. He knew some things. He told them, you know not. I judge no man, but they judged after the flesh. He says, I'm from above, but you're from below. I am not of this world, verse 23, but you are of this world. So that kind of gives you a way to characterize and organize the rest of that material there. Anybody else have another question or thought? Well, we'll wind this class up right there and pick up, as I said, around 8:13 the next time we have opportunity to be here. Thank you for your comments and attention.